Welcome back to part 2 of this video series on the Great War. Several years into the conflict, the essential problem developing for the Central Powers was how to secure food, medicine, and goods for their civilian population, since it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to buy them from international powers. Indeed, a major shortage of food emerged in Germany in 1917, for example, sparking civilian riots in Berlin. Why was it becoming so hard for the Central Powers to secure goods? Because the British Navy was choking off many European ports, imposing a blockade to prevent their enemy from resupplying. They were trying to starve out the Central Powers, hoping that it would lead them to surrender more quickly. Remember, Britain has a huge, well-equipped navy, and Germany, despite years' worth of effort, was never able to break this blockade effectively. So what do you do if you can't effectively face down your enemy's ships on the open ocean? You go after them underneath the waves. The Germans will begin deploying submarine technology to target and torpedo British ships using the element of stealth and surprise. Why do I mention German U-boat warfare now in our discussion of how America will eventually become involved in the Great War? Because of the Lusitania incident. This will be one significant step towards leading the United States to eventually enter the war. The Lusitania was a British passenger vessel carrying civilians from New York to the British Isles. On May 15, 1915, a German U-boat, or submarine, fired on the luxury liner. The ship sank in only 22 minutes, carrying with it almost 1,200 men, women, and children. The international outcry in this case, though, included strong words from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, because 128 of those who lost their lives were Americans. In the eyes of the American public, this attack on innocent people appeared to confirm what anti-German agitators in the country had been claiming now for years, that the Germans were, supposedly by nature, a barbaric and uncivilized people. Wilson immediately denounced Germany's actions and demanded that it end the practice of unrestricted submarine warfare. That is, the targeting of ships flying enemy flags without checking first to see if the ship was a vessel of war or, in the case of the Lusitania, a passenger or civilian ship of no military value. Actually, though, let's keep it real. The Germans fired on the Lusitania based on intelligence they had gathered that the ship was in fact carrying ammunition. Thus, they considered the ship was a valid military target. And the Germans were correct. The luxury liner was transporting a substantial cache of ammunition, some 4 million rounds for small arms, bound for the British Army, securely tucked away, they thought, beneath the passengers' staterooms. Back to our story. As the war continued to drag on and the British blockade crippling the Central Powers continued, Germany by 1916 began defying the promise it had made earlier to President Wilson. They began quietly resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. 4 U.S. sailors would die, for example, in March of 1916 when a German U-boat sunk the French ship the Sussex. Wilson was having to face the facts. While public sentiment in the United States was increasingly moving in the direction of helping out the Allied powers, most people were still not in favor of directly joining the war. 1916 was a presidential election year, too, and Wilson was running for a second term in office. One of his most successful campaign slogans that year, in fact, was, "He kept us out of the war." Wilson will secure a second term in the White House, but privately he begins taking steps to ensure that if the U.S. did enter the Great War, it would have what it needed to get the job done. For instance, he sought congressional approval to increase the size of the U.S. Army and Navy and to authorize the building of a merchant fleet. But he was also trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict, working tirelessly to promote the idea that peace without victory was what should take place. He will argue that it was time for a calm, rational ending to all the senseless violence of recent years. It was time, he argued, for both powers to simply pull the plug on the war. There was no need to keep fighting, for people to keep dying, only to end up with a winner on the one side and a loser on the other. Sadly, neither side in the conflict was willing to listen to reason, and the carnage continued. In fact, Germany was doubling down by early 1917 on a new plan they hoped would eventually give them an edge over their enemies. The Zimmerman telegram was a letter intercepted by British agents. It was sent from Germany's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmerman to the German diplomat in Mexico City. Essentially, Zimmerman's proposal was to bribe the Mexican government, to offer them money and a return of territory lost to them in the Mexican-American War if Mexico would aid the Central Powers in keeping the United States occupied in the Western Hemisphere and out of the war. When news of the Zimmerman telegram broke, the U.S. public was incensed. Anti-German sentiment burned more brightly than ever. But in addition to this latest revelation, in March of 1917, 4 unarmed American merchant ships were also sunk by German U-boats. Calls for war began to intensify across the United States. The final factor, though, that will nudge the United States to join the war will be the internal collapse of the Russian Empire under their new government. Russia undergoes a series of uprisings in 1917 as tired, hungry, landless workers rose up to overthrow the Russian regime under Tsar Nicholas II, eventually culminating in the Bolshevik Revolution. And one of the chief demands of the population was an end to the fighting in the war. Russia will sign a separate peace with Germany and withdraw from their position as one of the Allied powers. When that happens, President Wilson seizes the moment, claiming that it was now time for the United States to bring democracy to Europe. Congress agreed and issued a declaration of war on April 6, 1917. U.S. entry into the Great War was a huge morale boost for Britain and France. They no longer had to go it alone on the Western Front. On a more tangible level, American military aid would flow even more freely now that the United States was a full-fledged combatant. Further, they could now expect fresh-faced American recruits, nicknamed doughboys, soon to help them in battle. Domestically, though, the United States now has to assemble a fighting force quickly and also mobilize for war. In order to raise enlistments rapidly, the U.S. Congress passes the Selective Service Act of 1917. This new act allowed for the conscription, or draft, of young men 18 and older into the armed forces. While there was some debate over the draft in Congress among those who feared that making military service mandatory might create an unwilling army, there was actually very little resistance to the draft among the general population. In fact, almost 10 million American men registered willingly with selective service during the first few months of what became known as the Great National Lottery. By war's end, some 24 million men were registered by their local draft boards. There was also little resistance to the draft even among non-native-born Americans. In fact, foreign-born men constituted 18% of America's fighting forces overseas during the Great War. That means almost 1 out of every 5 soldiers was an immigrant to the United States, who fought and died on behalf of their adopted nation. Additionally, almost 400,000 black Americans served in the American uniform during the conflict, despite the fact that they were still relegated to segregated units and given non-combat service roles. Of those black regiments that did see battle, the 369th Regiment, which served in France during early 1918, won the most medals of any American combat unit for their bravery on the front lines. In addition to those serving in the armed forces, significant numbers of American women pitched in with the war effort. Serving abroad, some 20,000 women served as nurses on the battlefields of France. Female Red Cross workers also brought medicine and food to those in need. Here at home, women supported the war effort by stepping in to fill vacancies in heavy industry left by soldiers deploying overseas. We normally think of Rosie the Riveter in the context of World War II, but you have large numbers of women also helping out with military production during the Great War, as, you guessed it, riveters, welders, crane operators, and much more. The war also had a dramatic effect on American society at large, especially regarding the topic of civil liberties. The Wilson administration, concerned about rumors of supposed German spies in the United States, began to fan the flames of anti-German sentiment through the work of a newly created government agency known as the CPI. or the Committee on Public Information. This government agency began issuing pro-war propaganda in the form of films, pamphlets, public speakers, and more. While all of this sounds reasonable, encouraging your population to support the war, much of the propaganda put out by the CPI were lies about Germans or people of German descent. You can see, for example, here in this recruitment poster, how the Germans are depicted as subhuman apes bent on killing liberty and spreading evil around the world. In much of their literature, the CPI deliberately painted Germans or people of German descent, of which there are millions of German Americans here in the United States at this point, in a bad light. This led to mass hysteria around the country. German American-owned businesses, for instance, were burned. German language classes were canceled in schools across the country. And one German American, Robert Prager, a coal miner living in Collinsville, Illinois, was even lynched in 1918 by a crowd of his neighbors who mistakenly believed him to be a secret German agent. In other words, Americans were turning on Americans due to the fear stoked by the Wilson administration. That you cannot trust, they claimed, anyone who even had a German-sounding name. Things got so weird, Americans even began renaming foods that had German origin. German toast, for instance, became French toast. Frankfurters were renamed hot dogs. And sauerkraut got the new name Liberty Cabbage. On a more serious note, the Wilson administration began to fear that anti-war protesters might weaken the war effort. So they took steps to quell dissent through the passage of legislation in Congress to silence those opposed to American participation in the Great War. The Sedition Act, in particular, passed in 1918, prohibited, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language against the United States flag, the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. government, and even American military uniforms. This law was very unpopular, however, with Americans who valued their constitutional right to free speech. For some, it not only signaled a violation of their civil liberties, but revealed how scared the Wilson administration was of its own citizenry, despite the fact that there was no evidence of any anti-American agitation throughout the country. In the words of Charles Beard, a historian teaching at Columbia University at the time, someone, incidentally, who was pro-war himself, but also anti-censorship, Beard remarked, "If we have to suppress everything we don't like to hear, this country is resting on a pretty wobbly basis." Anti-war protesters such as Eugene V. Debs, leader of the Socialist Party, were jailed simply for making speeches protesting American involvement in the war. Teachers who questioned the war were fired from their jobs. The Sedition Act, in other words, generated intense controversy over our First Amendment right to free speech. Despite controversy at home, U.S. forces helped the Allied war effort on to victory. In November of 1918, an armistice was signed, and what was left now was to determine the terms of peace. Here's where Wilson, who had always been a proponent of peace without victory, was determined to leave his mark in history. He will lay out his so-called 14 points. Wilson analyzed the reasons European powers had initially gone to war. He then sought to address those past problems so that the world would never again have to experience another devastating global conflagration. Some of his 14 points included provisions such as freedom for countries formerly under the control of Austria-Hungary and Germany. Several new countries come into existence, in fact, in the aftermath of World War I, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania. Belgium's sovereignty was also restored. Another of his 14 points was to maintain freedom on the open oceans at all times, even during war. No unrestricted submarine warfare in the future, for example. But perhaps Wilson's most important proposal in his 14 points was his suggestion to create a new international diplomatic body. The League of Nations was created after World War I as an assembly that would meet to resolve conflicts peacefully between nations who were at odds. The hope was that by creating a forum for countries to air their grievances, it would diffuse tensions, hopefully averting any future armed conflicts. When the leaders of France and Britain met at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 to conclude peace talks, they listened to many of President Wilson's proposals. They even agreed to adopt a number of Wilson's 14 points into the final peace treaty between the Allied powers and Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, was the document that drew a close to the war between Germany and the Allied forces, and it will impose some significant restrictions on Germany moving forward. And here's where a big difference of opinion emerged between U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and the leaders of France and Great Britain. Wilson urged his counterparts to show forbearance in their treatment of Germany after the war. He argued, for example, that, quote, only a peace between equals can last, meaning that if someone left the negotiating table at the end of the conflict unhappy, feeling insulted or oppressed, then it might set the stage for a future conflict. Britain and France, though, had lost a lot of men in the war. They suffered a much higher body count than the United States, although the Russian Empire clearly suffered the biggest hit overall. Additionally, France had suffered tremendous damage to its infrastructure as a result of years' worth of fighting on its soil. Entire towns lay in smoking ruins, railroad lines were torn up, bridges blown to bits, and more. In sum, Britain and France wanted revenge. And no matter how nice and diplomatic Woodrow Wilson was, the two countries were tone deaf when it came to him changing their minds over Germany's fate after the war. Some of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 are useful to examine more closely now, especially since they will be major talking points used by Adolf Hitler in the 1930s to seek redress for what he perceived was the mistreatment of Germany by France and Britain after the Great War. And without a doubt, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were deliberately crafted to impose a heavy burden on Germany. Britain and France wanted to punish the country in the hopes that they would never want to wage war again. For example, the treaty limited the size of Germany's military moving forward. Their army was limited to only 100,000 men. Their navy and air force were virtually gutted. Next, Germany lost about 13% of its pre-war territory, northern portions given to Denmark and parts of the east to Poland and Czechoslovakia. They also lost their colonial holdings around the world. Further, a huge reparation or war debt was levied on Germany to the tune of 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of 33 billion US dollars. $1 billion is a lot of money today, folks. Imagine how much more that represents in 1919 economic terms. Finally, Britain and France insisted that Germany accept full responsibility for starting the conflict. This is what's known as Article 231, or the War Guilt Clause of the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. For the German people, this was the final insult. Not only was their economy and infrastructure wrecked by the war, not only did they have to pay a huge debt and see their military hobbled, not only did they have to stand aside and see a loss of their pre-war territory, but now they also had to be the designated bad guy. In effect, Article 231 forced Germany to effectively say, "I'm sorry, it's all our fault." The very thing Wilson worried about, therefore, someone leaving the bargaining table at the end of the war unhappy and feeling disrespected, came to pass. Fast forward to the 1920s and early 1930s, and German citizens, clinging to lingering feelings of humiliation and bitterness, will eagerly embrace the poisonous ideology of Adolf Hitler, a man who they will come to see will right all the wrongs done to them. Post-Paris peace negotiations, President Wilson returned back to the United States to lobby Congress to adopt the Treaty of Versailles 1919. He also took his case to the American public, who he urged to contact their representatives in the nation's capital to get this treaty ratified. While it's true there were many things in the document he did not like, he fully intended to protect his beloved 14 points, many of which had been adopted into the treaty. In particular, he wanted the U.S. to join the newly minted League of Nations and become a full-fledged member of the international diplomatic community. Only that won't happen. Due to ongoing debates in the U.S. Congress, the United States never signed the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. In an interesting historical irony, while it was an American president that dreamed up this new diplomatic body, the League of Nations, America never became a member. There were other problems with this new diplomatic body as well. Not only was the United States never a member, but the body was weakened as well by the fact that the Soviet Union was not permitted to join until much later in 1934. Germany, similarly, was not permitted to sit in the League of Nations initially. Another humiliation, German citizens believed, leveled at their country. Germany wouldn't be permitted to join until 1926. And finally, there was no enforcement mechanism enabled in the League of Nations, meaning that this diplomatic body could vote among its members to levy economic sanctions on states that were being aggressive. However, the League could not raise a military force to actually stop a so-called bad actor on the international stage from running amok. In other words, there was no bite to their bark. The League could denounce a rogue dictator's actions, for example, but could not actually physically stop a madman from wreaking havoc. And again, Adolf Hitler will be just this type of lunatic that will eventually take advantage of the weaknesses of the League of Nations